The Empty Quarter, a desert in the Arabian Peninsula named for the fact that it is so hot and dry that almost no one lives there. But once upon a time, this was a place with cities clustered around lush green oases on a trade route that led to the Roman Empire. One of these cities was known for the might of its people and the sheer height and size of its towers. However, according to legend, it was wiped out by a storm that covered everything in sand. What was this city, and could it be found again? Today, we're talking about Iram of the Pillars, also called by some Ubar, the Atlantis of the Sands. It was an Arabian city believed to have been wiped out in a single night by the wrath of the Almighty. But first, hello! My name is Garvin, and I read things and prattle on about them on the internet for your entertainment. With that, let's turn to the main stories about this place. The first story we're going to look at is from the 1001 Arabian Nights, and it tells us the story of Abdullah bin Abi Kalaba, who lost a camel, and like most of us in that situation, went looking for his lost animal, and he was a little luckier than most of us, because he found an abandoned city that was surrounded by vast fortifications, but someone had left the gate open. So he goes in and he sees that this city is actually made out of gold and silver, and almost everything is just covered in precious gems. There are fruit trees growing along the streets, all of them irrigated by artificial rivers that are just constantly flowing clear, cool water. And Abdullah did what most of us would do in this situation, I think. He gathered as many gems as he could, and he got out of there before something went wrong. And he got home, and unlike many of us today, he started telling people what he found, but I'm going to defend Abdullah. Back then, the penalty for banditry was death, and the penalty for theft wasn't much lower, and he wasn't changing those gems into money without telling people something. So it makes sense that he told everybody. Now, eventually the news reached the Caliph, who was the guy in charge at the time, and the Caliph turned to his advisors to find out, what was this city? Where did it come from? The Caliph's advisors let him know that this city had been built in ancient days by a king of the Adite nation who was named Shahad. And after inheriting his kingdom, Shahad decided to build this city as a heaven on earth for him and his court to live in. And this city took over 20 years to build, not just the construction, but it took years to gather enough gold, silver, and gems to serve as construction materials. After such a long wait, Shahad was thrilled, and he gathered his court, and they all moved out in a large caravan to travel to the city, but they never made it. Allah destroyed him and everyone with him, and then hid the city from mortal eyes. Shahad's son, who was unfortunately saddled with the name Shahad the Lesser, which is a terrible thing to call somebody, was able to recover his father's body and buried him in a luxurious tomb stuffed full of gold and gems. But, perhaps inevitably, that tomb was discovered and looted by grave robbers, perhaps showing the folly of hoarding wealth and not using it to any good purpose, because no matter what you do, you can't take it with you. The other story I found comes from the Quran, where the people of Ad built a great city with great fortifications, and perhaps because of the wealth or the security of the place, they grew very sinful and proud and disdainful of others. So the Almighty sent the prophet Hud, who in the story is stated to be Noah's direct great-grandson. Although if we take the flood story as the literal truth, we would all be directly descended from Noah, so I'm not sure. You know what? I'm overthinking this. I'm just going to keep moving. Hud is sent to explain to the Adites what they're doing wrong and what they need to do to straighten themselves out and make themselves right with, well, him. The people of Ad, however, reject Hud and refuse to repent. Maybe they're having too much fun, or maybe they just don't care. Who knows? So, first, the Almighty sends a drought, and this afflicts the people for several years, but they still refuse to repent. And after several years of HUD warning them and trying to set them straight, the Lord finally gets fed up and sends a storm that destroys them and buries the city under the sand. So I do kind of want to dive into a bit of a side note here. I found out in my research that there is a tradition that the Ad tribe, or Adites as members of this tribe were called, were giants. And that was part of the reason that their city was so big, with such great fortifications and tall pillars and towers, because the people building it were like twice or even 3 times the size of a normal person. And I was curious about that, so I dived a little deeper, and I found out the reason for this tradition. So, the Quran refers to Adites as a mighty people. That's how the word translates from Arabic to English, which in some cases that can mean physical size, but most of the scholars I looked at believed it referred to the Adites' political and military strength, not their physical height. And what happened is people heard mighty people and just kind of made the jump to giants instead of going, oh, this was a politically and militarily powerful kingdom. Now, I should note I'm not an expert in Arabic or in the Quran. I'm just repeating what I found online, so I do encourage everyone to look into this for yourselves and make up your own mind whether or not the Adites are meant to be giants in the story, or that's a mistranslation that happened after. Let's get back to the story, though. Something that's really interesting to me, at least, is that this story might have a basis in fact. This city might have existed, or at least a powerful, wealthy city with strong fortifications in this part of the world might have existed. Now, there's some archaeological evidence for this, but let me talk about the circumstantial evidence first. Ancient writers like Herodotus, Strabo, and Pliny the Elder wrote about how this part of Arabia was dotted with wealthy trade cities, usually built around oases, and they were maintaining this trade route through the desert, linking the Greek and Roman world to Yemen. Now, they also brought in goods from the Indian Ocean region, from all the way to India. But the big thing that was driving this trade was frankincense and myrrh, which the Greeks and the Romans had a huge demand for because they burnt it in their temples as offerings to their gods. From what I understand, it's possible that the empty quarter would increasingly get hotter and drier throughout this period, which would increase the amount of resources needed to maintain these cities. But the death blow here was when the trade collapsed. Part of this was because of the economic and political upheaval starting in the 3rd century AD, but the killing blow, at least in most scholars' opinion, was the fact that many early Christians refused to burn frankincense or myrrh in their temples, their churches, or chapels because they saw the burning of this incense as an adulterous pagan ritual. This complete nosedive in demand led to a period of chaos in this region of Arabia. I'm not going to get too in-depth into that, though. That is something we can discuss in a future video. Inspired by these stories, people would seek the ruins of Iram of the Pillars for generations. One of the people that were drawn to the story was Lawrence of Arabia, and from what I can find, he's actually responsible for giving it the name the Atlantis of the Sands. There were expeditions in 1947 and 1953, and they set out into the desert, but they didn't find it. In 1982, however, Nicholas Clapp, an amateur archaeologist, film writer, and documentary maker, a fairly good one. He had won 70 awards for his films, including Emmys. Well, he read a book about the city, and he got an idea. He pulled together a team of experts, and remembering how NASA had recently used a system called Space Imaging Radar to find ancient waterbeds buried under the Egyptian sands, he approached NASA with an idea. Now, today, using orbital radar or high-altitude LiDAR to find ruins is a perfectly normal and rather successful archaeological technique. If you watched my video last week on the lost city of Z, you'll remember I mentioned something like that was used to find the ruins in the Amazonian jungle. This was 1984 though, and this idea was a much harder sell back then, but Caltech Jet Propulsion Laboratory did agree to try it, and when they tried it, they found some faint white lines marking long abandoned caravan routes. Some of those routes were under sand that was over 600 feet deep. Even with that information, it wasn't until 1990 that Clapp and his team were able to get out there on site and start digging, but they found something. On the modern site of Sursur, when they dug down, they found an octagonal castle. This castle was notable for having over 30-foot tall towers and very large, thick walls, and the site itself was about 2,000 years old. An interesting note is that these very fortifications built to protect the place might have been what led to its undoing. The site was built over an underground cavern that was at the time believed to be full of water, and it was from that water that they were drawing from to meet the everyday needs of the people living there. As that cavern emptied out of water, though, the roof was no longer able to hold up the weight of this big stone castle, and it just fell right through the roof into the cavern, creating this visual I can imagine of like the desert itself was just swallowing the castle whole. However, before we get too excited, only about 150 people could have actually lived in the castle, which is kind of a far cry from the vast city of legend we've been talking about so far. And another wrinkle is that most scholars now argue that Iram and Ubar were originally names for regions, not a single city. It is believed, though, that Sursur was a major trade outpost, but it would have been one in a long line of outposts through the desert. That said, it's still an interesting site, and further discoveries might change what we believe about it, so just kind of keep your eyes open on that. The story of Iram, or Ubar, whichever name you prefer, still remains compelling, and because of that, it has shown up in a number of fictional works. On the video game side, for example, it was explored in Uncharted 3, it shows up in the Sunless Sea and Dominion 5 video games. It also shows up in Lovecraft's work as being somewhere near the Nameless City, although I should note Lovecraft uses a different spelling. There are several other books that refer to Iram or use it as a setting. Getting back to its reality, I have to admit it's pretty likely that there are several lost cities and settlements under the dunes of Arabia, so it's very likely that the story of a wealthy, powerful city that was erased by an angry desert storm has more than a kernel of truth to it, in my view. We will have to see what future archaeologists find. It's on that note, though, that I'm going to end this week's video. I hope you found it informative, or at least entertaining. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, or consider subscribing. All of that helps me in my eternal battle with the Dread Lord Algorithm. Terror be on his name. If you'd like to have a voice on future videos, please join my Everwise patrons. There's a link in the description below. They are voting on future content right now as we speak. Speaking of patrons, I also like to thank my biggest supporter, Big Steve. I hope if nothing else these videos are giving you ideas, man. Next week, we take an introductory look at the story of Hollow Earth. I hope you'll join me for that, but until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading!